Hello, and welcome to the Three Peak Master Leadership Experience. My name is Mino Vlahos, and I'm the co-founder of Three Peak Coaching and Solutions, where master leaders build healthy systems. Our company provides coaching and team workshops to executive leaders. Today, I am joined by Lars Olsen. Lars has spent the last 15 plus years working with emerging technologies and innovation across multiple industries. In the last 10 years, he's focused on emerging technologies in the commercial real estate space. He's worked across the spectrum, from helping tech startups to get their solutions out to the market and get adoption, to working with large commercial real estate players, helping them understand which new technologies are worth buying or investing in. So I'm very excited to welcome Lars to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Mino. I'm excited to be here and have this conversation with you.
I really love the topic we're going to talk about today, which is all about innovation, technology, and how to really infuse that into companies. So to begin with, I know this is something that we've talked about personally before. If you're thinking about, okay, I want to know what's out there, like what is innovative technology? What is emergent technology? What are some of the ways that you are able to stay in touch with all the evolving technology out there?
Yeah, it's a good question because it can quickly become overwhelming. At least today, when you have a lot of good blogs and podcasts and websites and news sources that obviously do cover technology and emerging technologies, and there's luckily there have there's a more and more sort of niche stuff that you can focus on and find the stuff that you're looking for, and not be that overwhelmed. But I will say, like, trying to keep tabs, and we can maybe get into that a little bit more later when we talk about process and how we can go about actually filtering through all the different technologies that are out there. But in general, I think trying to know and understand and be aware of everything is really tough. And I was kind of lucky that when I started working with emerging technologies in the real estate space specifically, that was very new, like 10 years ago. So in the beginning, I could just keep a spreadsheet with a handful of blogs and sources where I could find these emerging technologies and new solutions, and talk to the companies and try them out and essentially keep tabs of everything. But quickly that kind of spiraled, and there's just so much. When something works and there's a demand for something, that there's just going to be a lot of supply as well very quickly. So yeah, the short answer is there's so many sources and places you can go to find solutions. But honestly, these days, the solutions find me more than I find them. Because when you've been around for this amount of time, you essentially have I've been to all the trade shows for many years, and with LinkedIn, these tech startups and so on, they are really proficient and good at lead sourcing and finding their buyers, and now being one of those buyers or helping buyers vet those technologies, they tend to find me, which makes my life a lot easier. But yeah, that's kind of how I go about it today versus how I went about it, 10 years ago, finding technologies.
Yeah, so I want to be careful because it sounds like you might almost be encouraging cold emailing, cold calling. I don't want to overwhelm you, but
Yeah, for sure. I've been on the other. I started out in sales, so I've sold a lot of emerging technologies as well. So I definitely appreciate and respect the game, so to speak, of sales, and I find that fun. And when someone approach me and have a really strong pitch and good value propositions that fit with what I'm looking for in this moment in time and can show and demonstrate value very quickly, I love that. Like, I'm a sucker for a good sales process. So yeah, bring it.
I love
That's
it.
all good.
I love it. I've seen a similar journey in my own. The more that I do sales or reaching out to people, the more I almost, for the first time in my life, enjoy being pitched once in a while. So there's a
Right,
reciprocal. I was like, I can't just be pitching people and not be open to being pitched. That's not fair.
right. And I think personally, at least, I think it's easy to kind of, when you get a bad pitch or you get something and respond negatively and so on. But I try to either, if it's way out there, I don't, I try to respond every time and just say, I'm sorry, I'm not your target audience. Good luck. Because just any response is better than no response when you're on that other end. Just knowing that you at least missed your target will be helpful, so you can cross that lead off your list or that prospect off your list. So I try to kind of pay it forward like that, because I just remember how painful it was being on the other end and just have all these unknowns floating out there. But it is sometimes it's hard not to respond in sort of a snarky way if you if you feel like they're being super obnoxious or aggressive and are way off their mark. But I don't really do that. But it is tempting sometimes.
Yeah, I totally hear you. So one of the things that this is gonna be a bit of a tangent-ish, but I'm gonna go into the academic space for a moment, and then we can circle back to kind of the technology space. So
Mm-hmm.
what we've seen in the academia space is that the amount of total papers that are being published is going through the roof. It's skyrocketing. So there's a lot of research being done, but then when they looked at the actual innovativeness of those papers, there's actually a pretty big decline in how much innovation is happening in the research space, in the innovation space. And so there's this trend of a lot of activity, a lot of noise, and then innovations going down. And so when I think about the technology space, and I would love to hear if you see it differently, I have the sense that there's a lot of inventiveness. So we're inventing a lot of stuff, but its utility or truly innovative kind of capacity is probably not as much as the hype. What have you seen in terms of the inventiveness versus innovation? And then the second question, which we can also do a follow up, is around, well, how do you start to process and filter what is truly good versus just a lot of hype or buzz around it?
Yeah, no, I think that brings up and something that I see a lot of, actually. And I think, for real estate and commercial real estate, especially when you have innovation that's targeting an industry, and that industry in particular that is historically been very slow to adapt to new technologies and so on. What we've definitely seen is that as soon as someone gets, they have a good idea on paper and people buy into the concept very quickly, all of a sudden there's just a rush to, because there's so much money in commercial real estate, because they look at these funds and real estate companies that have billion-dollar contracts and billions of dollars in assets and so on. But at the end of the day, the margins in the business, like for instance in the operating of commercial real estate, the margins are typically very, very narrow. So there's a huge disconnect between the technology industry that typically operates with massive margins, right? Especially on the software side, you make it once and then you keep charging for it. That's a simplification, of course, because it requires a lot of resources to maintain it, but and further develop any software. But the difference is still very big, where on the software side you often operate with 30, 40, 70, 80, 90% margins in some cases, right? Whereas on the commercial side of operating commercial real estate, you're operating with 2-3% margins, right? So you then have all these players that they have a good idea on paper, they get some good feedback from their target market, and so many people are willing to, from VCs to real estate investment funds themselves, that are pouring money into all these tech startups that are then trying to provide these solutions. But getting people to actually find or finding value in these solutions and implementing these solutions turns out to be really, really difficult in many cases. So I agree with, what you were saying in academia, like that all the research shows that there's a lot of inventing happening, but there's not a ton of innovation that sticks, or that there's application on it for all of these inventions, right? And I see that every day. And I've myself, like what I've been doing the last, especially the last 5 or 6 years, specifically what I've been doing is assessing emerging technologies, trying to, find a use case for it, and then piloting and trying those technologies out in a semi-controlled environment. And that could be anything from a software that helps the back end of the operating, or hardware that's physically placed into buildings that will count people that walk through the building, and so on and so forth. And it's easy to create use cases for a lot of these technologies, but deriving value and proving ROI, and I'm sure we'll get a little bit more into the specifics around that. That is very, very hard, especially when you're dealing with a very small margin type of industry and business. Because investing in these technologies often costs a lot of money, first to buy the technology itself, and then to implement it, make sure you have adoption, and make sure that people are using and taking advantage of the new technology, especially when a lot of these folks have been used to doing fine without the technology for forever. So yeah, that sentiment I live and breathe and experience every day. So I see a lot of innovation, but there's honestly very few things that we can really get a lot of value out of, to be honest. But at the same time, the clients of my clients are demanding technology. All the RFPs that my clients are responding to spell like, what are you doing with new technologies? What new technologies can you provide us with, and so on. So in a lot of cases, we provide suggestions around technologies that we can experiment with and try out and pilot, and so there's definitely a lot of technology out there that do have value, and there's a lot of innovation that is super legit, but there's definitely a lot more hype than true tangible value that's being brought, I'd say.
And as you think about what you'd like to pilot, have you seen any patterns in terms of like winners and losers? Like, what are the things that you might say, hey, there's a chance this is worth a pilot? Or you might go to a conference, or someone might message you and you'd say, I've seen through experience that this might not really work. We're not going to pilot this kind of emergent technology.
Yeah. So, for instance, a lot of things, a lot of technology that I've worked with in the last couple of years have been IoT specifically, and there's a lot of good IoT technology out there, especially for the commercial real estate, and especially after the pandemic, when we've seen that occupancy levels are much lower in an office building, for instance. So, for instance, we have seen a lot of value and a lot of demand for building operators to understand what kind of usage the building has, right? So what are the occupancy levels? What are true occupancy levels? How many people are using the building on a day-to-day basis? Which area of the buildings are they using? And so on and so forth, so that the operators of the buildings can, reconsider the way that they, maintain and operate the building, right? From the janitorial staff to the engineering staff, a big office building, a 50-story office building, is a super complex, almost breathing organism that, you can't just have the bathroom sit unused for weeks or months on end on a 12th floor. The pipe's going to dry out, there's going to start smelling and things like that. The building has to be in use constantly, and all the parts of the building has to be used constantly. So for instance, the technologies that we've seen that's been super helpful to both the tenants and the occupiers of the buildings and the people operating and owning the buildings have been to really put in occupancy technology and occupancy sensors that really reads, as I said, how many people are actually in on what days, and can we spot trends? Can tenants themselves consolidate to using parts of the floor that they have leased versus the whole floor? Because as humans, it's easy when maybe you work from home on Mondays and Fridays now, and then you go into an office on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. But when you go in and you have a big office, you may try to find a seat or that's has some privacy if you're in an open office environment, and that means that you're then the only person that sits on a whole row of desks versus having 5 people on the same row of desks. So then everything needs to be clean, so that's going to cost more in janitorial services and things like that. The technologies that we've seen a lot of value in has been these occupancy technologies that gives a better understanding of exactly what areas of the building is used, how much is it used, when is it used, by whom is it used, and so on and so forth to service the building better. On the flip side, the technologies that we've received a lot of hype around and has especially been these sort of tenant experience applications, they're called. So there's been hundreds of millions of dollars that's been invested, maybe even billions, into all these like tenant experience apps. Like everyone has had these ideas that everyone that works in the building is going to have an app where they book a meeting room, where they order lunch, where they have their dry cleaning, where they have a dog walking service, where they have packages delivered to their offices, and God knows, just so many. So those are the kind of things that, yes, works really well on paper. But at the end of the day, what we've seen, there's no one's using these apps. So then the developers of the apps, they've tried to, quote unquote, force people to use the apps. For instance, in a multifamily setting, it's easy to force people to use those apps because you say, hey, you have to pay your rent on this tenant experience app. Okay, so you're already using the app once a month at least. And then there's maybe other services. Maybe you have your packages delivered to whatever part of the building that they allow packages to be delivered, and then you get a notification through that app. So it's easier to drive adoption in sort of a multifamily setting. But on the other side, in an office building setting or a commercial real estate setting, it's much harder because, the tenants themselves, they don't pay rent unless you're, maybe a WeWork one-man band or something like that. And so what we've seen is like, okay, those applications have tried to, force adoption through that they have to use the app to maybe access the building. Okay, so you're using the app every day to scan at the turnstile and get in, and therefore you're also going to book your dog walking services at lunch through that app and so on. And I think maybe the pandemic certainly impacted that because there's just a lot less people. We're seeing best case scenario in a market maybe 50% occupancy in office buildings. So that's a pretty big hit that they're taking on their sort of potential customer pool and operating pool. So all those models that were built to underpin the value of these tenant experience applications, that were going to do all these amazing rev share business models where the building operator provides this tenant but would get back 100 times what they're paying for it because of the rev share models for all the partner businesses they would put on these apps, we haven't really seen these things take off and provide any significant value at all. And starting to see more and more of these companies go under. And even though I said, with the occupancy sensors and the IoT sensors have brought a lot of value, what we have seen is that, without getting too specific on technical requirements and so on, is that a lot of these companies, they build these sensor technologies and they're trying to target everyone, like the owners of the building, the tenants of the building, the different service providers for the buildings and so on. But you can't provide a single dashboard that visualizes that data that's useful to all those different consumers or end users, because someone who owns the building wants to know occupancy levels and things like that, right? Whereas someone that operates the buildings or provide janitorial services wants to know which conference rooms were used in the last 24 hours so they can clean only those conference rooms that have been used, so they're not cleaning the conference rooms that haven't been used, because that's a waste of time and money for everyone. And of course, the users of the actual tenants or occupiers of the building have yet another set of analytics that they probably would be interested in looking at. So what we've seen with a lot of these hardware providers is that they're trying to, cover the cost of the hardware. Hardware is super expensive and difficult to make. So they're trying to, get their recurring revenue and their income from the software subscription that goes along with the hardware. But there's just not enough, like they can't provide, quote unquote, dashboards for all the different use cases. So what we worked on is more like trying to be completely hardware agnostic and building our own independent data layer that can take information from anywhere. And then we customize the outputs specifically for the different types of end users. That's really the only way that it's viable and feasible. And that costs a lot of money, requires a lot of resources. And what we're seeing is that a lot of these hardware companies are either consolidating or going under or being forced to white label other sensor providers as hardware. So when I'm starting, I'm getting, let's say in a year, I look at a couple dozen different hardware providers, and half of them will use the exact same sensors from some other hardware provider that have figured out the technology. They just put their own sticker on it and create their own dashboard that's proprietary and their secret sauce. So I'd say those are like the very specific examples or two opposites of something that on the hardware side with the occupancy sensing stuff, you have value, very straightforward value propositions that have been demonstrated to bring and have value. Whereas on the other hand, you have these applications, tenant experience applications in particular, that had a lot of promise, a lot of hype, a lot of investment, but really hasn't lived up to that expectation. And you won't know until you try and fail or try and succeed. So it's been an expensive lesson for a lot of us in the industry trying to figure out, which technologies do bring value and which do not. Yeah.
For those listening, can you explain a little bit IoT, Internet of Things? A little bit, if someone isn't familiar with this part of technology, what IoT is and encompasses?
Yeah, for sure. And I should probably have done that up front. But essentially, think of IoT as kind of a catch-all for everything from your smart fridge to your smart sprinkler systems to your occupancy sensors in our people counting sensors to any piece of hardware, meaning a fridge can be hardware, any sort of physical object that you or someone or something interact with that is connected to the internet and typically sends some type of data to a cloud instance, or that you're sending something to that piece of technology. For instance, if you have a smart lock on your front door and you have someone that is coming to water your plants while you're on vacation, you can, open your app, open the door within a specific time frame for your neighbor to come in to water the plants. That is an Internet of Things thing. And then on the other side, on the more extreme side, in a large data center or warehouse, you could put vibration sensors on every piece of sprinkler system, HVAC, any type of piping, or ventilation fans and so on. And then you can detect any sort of unusual behavior in the vibrations and then send an alert to the engineering team that will come and have a look at a faulty fan, or you can have a water leak detection sensor if there's any flooding or spilling or from a clogged toilet, things like that. We even put sensors into soap dispensers, into trash bins in airports, so we know exactly the soap levels and so on, so we can be more proactive in the way we go about making sure that the end users of these spaces have the best possible experience. And all of these things are connected to the internet, and that's what we call Internet of Things. So it's kind of a very broad term, but yeah, it's kind of in the name. If it can be connected to the internet and it has served some type of utility, I'd say it's an Internet of Things item.
Yeah, I was going to share that when, I think it was around 2016, I was working with a CEO of a pretty large cleaning company. So they make the products that clean a lot of these large sites like airports. And back at that time, 2016, she was already talking about Internet of Things and putting in sensors. And, I had never really at that point considered Internet of Things, IoT. And so everyone was really talking about how visionary she was. And it's really, I think, come to pass. And this, as an end user, you go through the airport, and I don't know how many thousands of people go in and out of airport bathrooms on a daily basis. And if everything is great, you kind of just don't think about it. You only start to think about it when
Yeah.
things are dirty, when things are not working. And yet we don't
Yeah.
consider how much effort must be put into cleaning these bathrooms at such a large scale with such large volume, and to also do it in a way that's also efficient for the company, organization, whatever, the building, whatever we define as the entity, where yes, you could have, of course, someone just standing there 24/7 cleaning, but it's not the most efficient allocation of resources, right? So it's pretty
No,
incredible what IoT could
exactly.
do.
Yeah, and I think it's a true, and this is where innovation has been a true game changer and is affecting valuations of big assets meaning different types of commercial real estate types, from airports to warehouses and so on, and in the way you operate these buildings. To your points, like, we can now, with these types of technologies, instead in the let's take a step back. Like, in the past, you would hire a cleaning company or an engineering company, or anyone that helps service the building, makes the building run. You would agree to a set of predetermined service intervals, cleaning intervals, and so on and so forth, right? You clean the conference rooms or the bathrooms X amount of times a day, and so on. And but now you can be more dynamic in that approach, right? So you can use all these sensor technologies to then only service the areas that needs to be serviced and when they need servicing the most, right? And then on the back end, a lot of the things that we're working on now with predictive maintenance, we call it, and large I mean, it's AI, but AI is also a very broad term these days. But we're essentially working with these models that will, based on trend data, help us analyze when a piece of equipment may fail so that we can go and replace it before it fails, because it's always more expensive to fix things retroactively instead of fixing things up front, essentially, right? That's why you take your car for an oil change every 6 months or every year or every 5 or 10,000 miles, depending, what kind of car you have. Of course, if you have an EV, you don't need to do that. But, with an internal combustion engine, you need to service it regularly at regular intervals. You're not, if you wait until the oil lamp is flashing, that may be too late, right? And so it's kind of the same concept, but now we're trying to be even more predictive and at the same time also improve. So to your point with the as you said, with the CEO that you've been working with, like you've now seen that, a lot of places have these smiley face buttons that provide feedback on the end user experience. One of the things that we're doing now is experimenting with putting in these screens and displays in everything from airport restrooms to conference rooms and office buildings and so on, that have those smiley faces, right? So we can correlate the user experience with the occupancy levels, right? Is the user experience poor because there's just a heavy load of use on any particular space? Or is the experience poor because the soap dispenser is always out, or the toilet paper is out, or the lights out, or the toilet's overflowing, whatever it is? And then you can provide instant feedback through these displays. So we have now dashboards that we provide airport operators with, that where they can, monitor real time and pull daily, weekly, monthly reports that gives them insight in how they can improve the operating of the airport and improve the experience of the people using it, right? So that's, again, very useful and tangible values that can be derived from investing in these types of technologies, for sure.
So this question is really just about one of my biases and pet peeves. So I want to tell you kind of my bias, and then I want you to correct me or tell me your opinion. But right now, there's so much, again, hype and buzz around kind of the generative AI, the Chat GPT, LLM, like large language model kind of part of AI. And every company I go into, it's like what everyone's talking about, and everyone's trying to solve this
Yeah.
problem of, the GPTs and how we're going to automate the workforce. And there's a lot of talk about it. And yet when I look at statistics in the United States, about 4% of workers are actually using something like Chat GPT or Claude or any of those models on a regular basis. And yet 95% of the conversations are about this thing. And it's dominating every conversation. There's a lot of, again, fear and optimism and all this stuff. I don't know if it's a worry or just a thought, but like, I'll say it's a worry maybe, that in this conversation, we're kind of missing that there's so much other technology that's also developing at a rapid pace and also might be reaching a more mature phase. For instance, like IoT feels like it's in a more mature phase than like ChatGPT, like right now. So do you feel like there is kind of is it like we're in a hype period? Do you feel like it's actually warranted? Is there overshadowing of other kind of cool emergent technologies that maybe should be getting a little bit more attention right now?
Yeah, no, those are. I think there's for sure a lot of hype, but I do think there's a lot of promise. Personally, I don't really. I was very excited about, like everyone, all the promise that ChatGPT brought, and thought my life was going to be, so much easier and so on and so forth. But honestly, I don't really use ChatGPT myself. I've tried to use it, and but personally, just for the work that I do, it just isn't super helpful, other than summarizing maybe some long research paper, or bring out some, or that I've experimented with putting, things that I've written into it and ask it to do better or find faults or stuff like that I think a lot of people have tried using it for. But for me personally, it hasn't brought a ton of value, sort of the generative AI that we see from these things. But at the same time, we have experimented with and we think there's a lot of promise on the for this technology on the business side. And I think, as an example, we have a challenge in the commercial real estate industry that we have a lot of data. We're producing a lot of data. The buildings produce a lot of data, from the building systems to the people in the building and so on and so forth, right? So there's so much data that's being produced, but a lot of this data is siloed in a lot of different systems. So you may have a building management system or a BMS that's housing a certain set of data. You may have a CMMS system that does, all the work orders for the building that exists in one silo. Then you have the occupancy and sensor technology, vibration sensors, and all those things that's gathering data in another silo. And then you have the tenants and the users of the building with their tenant experience app or whatever it may be, or the HR data or whatever other. And these data sets are powerful if they can be brought together in certain ways and leveraged. But getting those pieces of data into the same pool and then be massaged and abstracted and apply business logic to that data and algorithms and so on is very, very hard. And getting just different systems to talk together is very, very hard. And getting the data sets to make sense to each other is very, very hard. So for example, let's take a building engineer and a building operator. They have, what would be super powerful when it comes to predictive maintenance. And this is where we've experimented a lot with AI, because we think there's a lot of promise there. So for example, you have all these building systems, from the HVAC, so the ventilation, the heating, the cooling, to sprinkler systems, ingress, egress systems, alarm systems, all of these things, right? So you have all of this data, of course, that's being corralled and gathered and stored somewhere in some type of cloud. But at the same time, you have building engineers that are going and checking on these systems, that, write stuff down by hand, or maybe they even have an iPad where they write down, when they make their rounds and check on these building systems and do their diagnostics and logging, pressure levels on pipes and what have you, right? And the rotation at which the fan is spinning and things like that. But each individual engineer will describe the same problem in a different way. So if you have 10 building engineers that are looking at a fan or a ventilation systems, and they are experiencing the exact same problem or anomaly in the behavior of the system, they may use 10 different ways in describing that particular behavior and issue. So then, so we may be able to tell the LLM or the AI system, like, if XYZ is happening, this is the prescribed fix. But at first, you need to then teach the system that there is 10 different ways in which this particular symptom is being, described or discovered and entered into a system. And just the sheer challenge in getting everyone on board to using standardized ways of describing the same thing and problem. And even, we've looked at uploading, a lot of all these pieces of equipment comes with some type of service manual and user manuals, essentially. And you can upload all of those and, say that, after so-and-so, however much time has passed, you probably need to replace a bearing here and there. So you can teach the system all those things, that's a pretty straightforward way of getting to sort of a predictive maintenance schedule, if you will. But there's just so many band-aids and fixes that are being put on these systems in a case of emergency or in an outage, or some creative engineer who probably had a better solution to the problem than the instruction manual dictated, but then they've used parts that may be third party. So what we've then tried to do is look at, okay, accounts receivables or accounts payable, and go into all the, because now everyone is using software, right? Everything that's being purchased is being recorded, right? So we're looking at, okay, can we take all that data, put into the large language model, and teach it, okay, so this was the company that we used for this particular fix. They used these particular parts, and so on and so forth. So very quickly, just fixing a sprinkler system or an HVAC system or a surveillance system in any type of building, from an airport to an office building to a school to a hospital. And, as you think of all the different types of commercial real estate that's out there, from hospitals to educational facility, you can start imagining how unique each of these different types of buildings are, and how they're, they all have their own type of systems. Like a surveillance system for a school may be very different than for a hospital versus a data center or nuclear facility, or, whatever it may be. So yeah, to get back to your point, getting use of AI, on paper is very easy to create use cases and value propositions and so on. But in reality, is very, very, very hard. And we're working on it, and we still see a lot of promise, and we're investing a ton in it. And, I work with a lot of startups that have good ideas, and with these, building operators and real estate funds and so on. So there is a lot of value, but I'd almost say, like, right now you need to have a pretty clean set of data. So for instance, real estate brokerage, they can probably use, or I know they're using a lot of, quote unquote AI technologies to better understand valuations of buildings, because, you just have clean financial data to plug in that will be sort of same for markets and building types and so on and so forth. So, and occupancy levels, all of these things that underpin the valuation of an asset, those metrics are always kind of the same and described in the same way. And you kind of have a common denominator that you're going to assign a dollar value to a lot of these metrics, right? So in those instances where it's a straightforward, clean input, you'll get a clean output. But it's a cliche that you're only as good as the data that you put in, right, when it comes to these things. But that's just a hard truth. So, and I think just the last point on generative AI, especially when we think about how that technology works, it's essentially just looking at historical records and trying to predict the next word, and then the next word, and then the next word, or the next line to draw, and things like that, right? So it's prone to hallucinating, which a lot of people have seen in the news, that you ask the Google AI Gemini about pizza recipe, and it's suggesting to put glue on the pizza, or that you should eat rocks to harden your teeth, or whatever. There's been so many obscure things, and this is, I think, just proof of when you have really weird data that you're teaching the system with, well, you're going to get really weird outputs, right? When you're training your LLM based on Reddit forums, yes, you're going to get a pizza recipe with glue, right? That's just the way these things work.
Probably
So
some racist comments to go with it.
for sure, for sure. So
Yeah.
it's hard, but I do. At the end of the day, I think there's a lot of promise, but there's a lot of hype, and I think when it comes to innovation in general, it is very easy to get carried away with the hype. But that's why it's so important to have sort of a sober process and a method in place that you know gets you gets you to at least like some type of conclusion if the technology or the innovation effort actually brought any value, for
Yeah, what it
sure.
reminds me of is I'm going to reference part of Nate Silver is a statistician. He does a lot of forecasting with sports, elections, and he has a book
Hmm.
called The Signal and the Noise. And one of the things that stood out to me is that when we look at major technological breakthroughs, typically when they come out, actually there's about a decade of lost productivity. All the way going back to like the printing press in like the 1500s, or computing, personal computing that kind of really started to come out in the 70s into the 80s. There was a decade where productivity fell really low and then skyrockets. So there's this kind of boomerang effect because in the first 10 years, we actually don't know how to apply certain technology. We don't know how to get the best use of it. And so it's a tough thing because we actually need folks to go experiment and figure out what does it look like in reality? How do we make the best use of this technology in reality? But there's a lot of trial and error and there's a lot of failures and there's a lot of wasting resources in that way. But once we start to understand the use case, then productivity skyrockets way more than it was the 10 years prior. And so my feeling with the kind of I'll just my last thoughts on the kind of generative AI, chat GPT kind of is where what a couple years into kind of more mass use. And I understand there is a lot of both excitement and concern. But my hypothesis, if this is in the same vein, is that we're going to spend probably 5, 10 years trying to figure out how do we apply this. It's also improving day by day. New models are coming out, so the hallucinations are going down. The capacity of these systems is going up, but it might take almost 10 years for us to figure out how do we really use these in a constructive way. So I'm not surprised that
Yeah.
like I also don't use it that much because I'm like it's not
Right.
that useful to me right now.
Right. And I think from a sort of a philosophy perspective, what I think is really interesting now is that when ChatGPT was launched, everyone was floored by the technology, shocked, and so on. And but now we're in the middle of this super fast evolution, but we're already completely desensitized to all these major leaps of advancements that these systems are seeing, right? So we're kind of brushing off, there's a new chat GPT that is like exponentially better than the previous one, but it still can't walk my dog for me. So, it can correct my papers a little bit better, but it's just hard to see it. So I think we're just slow walking into this sort of, I don't know if we're going to have AGI, um, any time soon, like a sentient piece of software. But I don't necessarily think we'll know when we have it, because we're already now in this evolution. And when I do find also what you were saying about productivity super interesting, because I do think that's something that we're definitely seeing every day with technology, that the promise is a lot of productivity, but getting people to using the new technology, or getting people to use new technologies, is one of the most unproductive things I've often experienced. And take for instance, like all these like collaboration tools. Like there's one client that I've been working with now for 3.5 years, and I think I've had to use at least a dozen different collaboration softwares. And every time there's a new software, there's a new implementation team that comes in that's going to help everyone get trained on the new collaboration software and so on. And I don't know how many hours I've lost to sitting through onboardings and trainings, and then 6 months later, no one's using this particular productivity thing, and we're back to emails, and just 90% is just emails and 10% Teams messages, right? So it's just, when it comes to technology and productivity, there's for sure, productivity gains to be had all over the place, but it's so much, for me at least, like change management. You can't have innovation and investing in innovation without change management, proper good change management, because getting people to use new technologies is kind of the hard. Everyone loves trying it, but changing their day-to-day behavior and using the technologies, I mean, I have by now lost count of how many times I've, talked to a client, been like, okay, this type of technology we think will, increase productivity or help you perform or things like that, right? And then everyone's on board. Everyone from the end user to whoever signs the checks, and everyone's on board. And we have an implementation plan and a training plan, adoption plan, all of those things. And just as I said, with going through that on these collaboration softwares, getting people to use new technologies, period, is just really, really hard. Even when it makes their life easier, it's really hard to change human behavior. So that's why I think, change management, instilling this mentality into the people that you're trying to change their behavior, like there has to be a reward, obviously, but and incentives for them to use it, instead of, maybe it's a stick and a carrot. But it's like, and even when you do everything right, and as I said, it makes the end user lives easier, just changing people's behavior is so very, very difficult. And that costs essentially a lot of money and resources, because you have to stick with it way past when you're you would just want to give up and go back to the way you used to do it, because everyone's pissed, everyone's tired of learning the new ways and so on. But yeah, so getting adoption is generally just really, really hard for new technologies. And there's a lot of things you can do from, VCs love to talk about gamification. Just gamify your software and everyone will use it, and so on. But there's just a lot more to it, for sure.
Yeah, just even a personal example, like we have I have two other co-founders. There's three of us, three founders of the company. Like I use HubSpot as a CRM to manage our sales and marketing process essentially. And one of my co-founders, I love him, but he keeps reverting back to Google Sheets. And it's like drives me
Yeah.
crazy because I'm like, we're three founders and we can't even align on one technology to use to manage leads.
Right.
And I've been, so this is three people, right? And I've been in companies that are 300 people where I used to work, where passing
Yeah.
any new technology, it seemed like it was an impossible task. And then I've been in big companies, big corporations consulting, and they're actually quite innovative and they're actually moving into new technologies. And that's like hundreds of, like 100,000 people. So you can have a small company where you would think theoretically, okay, it's only 300 people. Like this should be an easier task on paper to put a new technology, a new process. And yet there's way more cultural blocks than this giant corporation that has something in its culture or formula that's enabling technology adoption. So what have you seen that helps a company actually integrate innovation and actually get with the times, regardless of size? Have you seen something that supports that process?
Yeah, I think in general, it's really hard to change anything unless you have buy-in from all the stakeholders. And I mean, that's kind of such a consulting cliche and obvious thing, but I think it's obvious for a reason, right? So, for instance, at a large, one of my clients now has 150,000 employees, right? So large enterprise. And what we've seen often is that, okay, there's a ton of buy-in for a certain solution on the ground level. So the people, certain piece of technology that will be super helpful in a day-to-day, increase productivity, efficiency gains left and right. We've piloted it and so on. But then all of a sudden, there's just a lack of appreciation or understanding at the top level or at a much higher level. And at a company like that, right, a mid-level could be pretty far away from the boots on the ground, right? So at some point in that chain of command, there's just someone that doesn't, for lack of a better term, doesn't get it, right? So they have all their folks saying like, this will improve our day to day, this will, and so on and so forth. But because this one person or this group of people, they just don't see it, and they don't have, because they have 1,000 things to consider, and they're busy themselves, right? So spending time and learning about this particular technology or change, they just don't have the time or the resources or appetite or interest, right? So it dies on, right there and then, right? Or you can have it the other way around. You could have, from the higher ups, there could be, strategic reasons for investing in a certain piece of technology. They can see all the benefits because they have, the helicopter view, the bird's eye view. They see how all the different pieces connect. They see the bigger picture, and they totally understand, like, okay, this will have the impact, and they have all the decision-making power and can drive this through. But no one went and got the buy-in from the boots on the ground. So they're just feeling like they're getting this new process or new technology shoved down their throat. And there's a lot of pushback because they haven't been educated on why it's helpful to them and why it's useful. So, let's say the company invests, a ton of money into this new technology, but there wasn't any good strategy for educating and getting the end users on board and giving them time to ingest and digest and find ways of incorporating and utilizing this new technology. So it ends up not being used. So I think for the first step is to make sure that everyone's aboard, everyone's understanding, everyone's willing to, quote unquote, pay the price, if that's signing a big check, taking a big chunk out of their budget and investing in the solution, or spending a little additional time doing tasks that they could normally do much quicker. But, in the long run, they'll, value this piece of technology and change. So I think that's just really being often overlooked, and, especially at large corporations, but this can happen at small companies as well. And, often in the world of real estate, it could be, a small firm that has 25 people. It may be a third generation family that owns and operates and have a few $100 million worth of real estate assets under management. So effectively they're working with all these third parties that help run all of these assets. So maybe though that they don't have all these people on their direct payroll and they don't have the power of them, but they're trying to force this change in which they are operating onto a bunch of third parties that they have no control and say over, other than that they hold the the agreement and so on. So just being strategic about, going out there, making sure that you have buy-in from everyone, that everyone understands what it's going to take, because you can't just take whoever sells you the technology. They're always going to make it sound really easy to adopt and use and get up to speed and so on. But in the real world, it's seldom, that easy. It's easy to make something sound good on a pitch deck in PowerPoint, but getting real people in the real world to change is very, very different.
Yeah. And I caveat my next question by saying, like, I really love technology. Like, I try to adopt whatever is the newest. Like, I really love experimenting. So this question is not coming from I really have an optimistic lens on technology. And what we're hearing is that there's also times where it sounds really easy on a pitch deck, like you said, but it might not match reality. And I'm wondering, like, something that struck me earlier in the conversation is that you're, purchasing potentially hardware or even software, and these companies are either folding or consolidating. So, and I was like, oh wow, so you could take a risk, buy from a startup, and then tomorrow they don't exist anymore, but you've incorporated or tried to integrate it into a pretty large enterprise. What are the kind of risks or downsides of being a little bit more on the early adoption side of things?
Yeah, that's a very loaded question. That's it is what makes, again, having a good vetting process in place doesn't only mean that you're vetting the usefulness of the technology, but also the provider of the technology. So, for instance, that's why a lot of the people that I work with, we're trying constantly to, if we look at hardware, we want the hardware to be software agnostic. Or if we're looking at software, we want the software to be hardware agnostic. If we're looking at those types of technologies, exactly for that reason, because I've seen, so many people be burned by this, and I have myself, right, where you invest in something and then the company folds or gets acquired and absorbed into a bigger platform and things like that, and you can't get the use out of it that you once did. And so it is something that's really, really challenging. So I think there's a fine line between early adopter and I think if you want to be an early adopter of something, you just have to be comfortable with some level of risk and have, a plan B and a plan C, have some type of redundancy in place. Because, anything can sort of, any company, no matter how big and successful the company is and how valuable their services are to some folks, those companies, whatever industry, whatever it is, could go under, or could, or experience some type of detrimental, have some type of failure or whatever it may be. So never place all your eggs in one basket, especially if you are trying to leverage and use new technologies. I'm not saying that if you're looking to buy Slack as a company, you should buy Teams as well, right? But you have to have, because you'll have, your redundancy if Slack goes down is email and text messages and phones and so on. So you kind of have to think about all of those things and think about what the risk that you're willing to take. I will say on that, there is generally it's kind of ironic that innovation is the first thing that gets cut. Like when companies are experiencing hard times, they look at, where can we cut costs? And, the innovation is often where you cut first. But that is such a short-term gain, long-term loss, because you could then effectively set yourself up for so much pain later. right? And innovation is a, again, very broad term and things like that. But we've seen time and time again, anyone that's gone to business school, have lost track of how many case studies that they've read of companies that were on top of the world and then, fell asleep behind the wheel for a split second, and all of a sudden some, fancier, smarter, more agile company came in and started stealing their market share, and before you knew it, they were left behind. So the I think investing in and maintaining an appetite for being an early adopter, but just being very smart about it and being very deliberate about what technologies you invest in and adopt is just very, very important.
So I'll share a couple stories and then bridge into the question. So when I was a few jobs ago, I worked at Ernst & Young, and at EY, we used to do like budgeting for every client engagement pretty much by hand, quote unquote. So each kind of analyst, senior analyst, was in charge of opening an Excel sheet and basically keeping track of all the project financials. So the hours we would work, the run of the project. And I was working with a manager, and we basically we landed a huge project for us, which was, I think, like a $15 million project, which had like 50 people on it. So we made some kind of again, this was in Excel, so it's not like the most advanced technology, but we made um, a project in Excel where we automated pretty much all of this, where you could, like, instead of spending like 20 hours a week, we did everything formulas, VBA, so that like by the end of it, like you just copy pasted whatever input you needed into the sheet, and it automatically gave you charts and data and this thing and that. And then in a second company where I worked at, it was a different kind of company, but we were doing tons of like report writing or different analytics. And again, I know like a solid amount of Excel. So I sat down, and I get, tired of doing repetitive work. I'm a bit lazy. So instead, I went and created different tools, again, to automate these processes or get it to like 80%. And then you go in, like, human tweak it, like, okay, the report is 80% done. I go in and I change some of the sentences, make it a little bit more humanistic. And again, this is before ChatGPT existed, so that would have solved that, period. But in every case where I was making a tool and it was like significantly, like with the report writing thing, I would have saved about 50% of my time on these projects. With the budget forecasting, like, I saved the team a lot. And in all these cases, I went to, these are different companies now. I would go to senior management, senior leadership. I would present these tools. I would like showcase, it's literally built for free by someone who's literally already using it. It works. Other people have tried it. It works. It's going to save us like 50% of our time. So that's a pretty huge time saving for like a service business where it's all kind of human labor, human capital. And in every case, it went nowhere. Like, no one really gave a fuck about what
Yeah,
I was building,
that's
what I was doing. And it
why
was
do you
like, I
think
sit there and I'm like, what
that
did I do
is?
wrong? How did I
Yeah,
not, did I get the clearly it's an influencing problem. So when you're working with these different stakeholders and like, something could work or has potential, like, what
yeah.
are some best practices around like influencing or stakeholder management? Or what advice would you even give a younger me that was trying to get these things through?
Yeah, and I'm just curious, like like looking back at it, in hindsight being 2020, like what do you think you could have done differently there, like knowing what you know now?
So each one, those two companies, a bit of a different. So with EY, what I did was, my manager and I, we did a presentation to our whole team about the thing,
Mm.
but ultimately we didn't do any sort of actual, like, beyond that. I wasn't that invested in spreading it throughout the group, because I was like, look, I made it, I use it, but it's not like I owned a product that I needed to sell. So I was basically
Mhm.
like, okay, if you like it, come to me, shoot me an email. And no one
Mhm.
did that. So I think in hindsight, if I really cared about spreading this, then I would have to almost go and internally sell it and
Yeah.
use it as if it's my product. So in that case, it was one of those, like, I didn't push it at all. In the second case, it was a lot of politics. So there was another team that already had been given a lot of time and budget to solve the same problem and had
Hmm.
failed to do so. And so
Right.
eventually, as I was going up the influencing ladder, they recommended me talk to that team. And that team just basically shut me down and was like, no, this probably puts our jobs at jeopardy. So that was, I think, in
Right.
that case, I don't know that I would have done anything different, but it just was the landscape I
Hmm.
was in.
No, and I think that's you're touching on some really, really uh, key pieces there, right? Often it is as simple and as complex as company politics, right? Someone else is invested in something that opposes whatever change or innovation that you're bringing forth, and so on. So, I again, getting the key stakeholders on board or all the stakeholders, right, to get on the same page and so on, but then also have identify, and you probably learned this, through sales process that you work with, right? Knowing every objection that you will get beforehand and essentially have multiple answers for each objection, right? So that you can be proactive. So you don't even wait for the objections or the naysayers to bring their arguments, but you're showing consideration and thought that you appreciate, their particular concerns or and so on and so forth. So again, I think it's like that the human aspect of it, like that human interaction, the time. Some people just need more time to, sit with certain changes and before they get on board, and then not trying to necessarily force it. Of course, at some point, there's always going to be holdouts. There's always going to be, someone that's against whatever it may be, right? So I think finding, a word that's often being used in consulting and popular these days is, finding a champion for your solution and working with that person and being strategic, like, for instance, if there's one particular team in your case that's already been given resources, they've invested in, they may not want to look foolish because someone came up with a better and easier and cheaper solution to something that they've, if you can go to them and figure out, why they felt and kind of bring them into the fold and give them, even though they didn't do anything, but make them feel like they have some type of ownership or influence and so on. Because often it just comes down to personal egos or, we're all human. So you kind of just have to be, I think, at least, just very considerate of other people and just try and step into their shoes. And it's kind of, maybe, you it comes down to feelings. Like, people have feelings, right? So you just want to make sure that you're not creating any problems or obstacles for yourself by unnecessarily hurting someone's feelings that could have been a powerful champion. And I think businesses and business leaders and stuff are getting better at this, because in the, historically, you have a strong leader that's just gonna, muscle everything through. And, in some cases, sure, that's needed and that works and so on. But I think if you want, a healthy, good environment that everyone is working in, and where a place where people are excited about change and willing to have change, that means that you need to trust each other and feel like everyone's looking out for each other and creating, that type of safe space. And it could be as simple as, maybe someone who's been at the company for a very long time, may be part of a different generation, not super comfortable with new technologies, or, maybe not scared of it, but just uncomfortable with the idea of change. And then just spending a little extra time with that person and letting that person, say their piece, and getting that person on board is just going to be so much more powerful, because if that person is kind of known to be a quote unquote Luddite, that's what people call that person behind their back, because they're always against innovation and new things and changes and so on. But yeah, just spending a little extra time with those people and make sure that they feel heard. And I think that just goes such a long way. But in today's world, where everything's moving at a very fast clip and people feel like, there's a time crunch for everything, and that's very hard. It's a lot easier said than done. But I do think, just taking the human aspect into consideration can never be, overestimated.
Yeah. And so for my last question, because our company 3Peak, we really work with more senior leaders, typically like vice president, general manager, C-suite. So if you consider that audience, and today we started talking from all the way from like how to find innovative technology, how to filter and like actually figure out what's going to work, all the way to the more organizational dynamics of how we influence and integrate that innovation into an actual company. This can be as broad or as specific as you want, but if you think about that kind of more senior level audience, what advice would you give them about emergent technologies and innovation?
Yeah, again, like I think being very deliberate about why you're considering any type of new technology, emerging technology, why you're considering uh, investing in it, and being honest with yourself. Like, are you looking for an easy fix to a problem? Are you looking to outsource a problem? Are you trying to make life easier for yourself, or are you trying to make change that is going to have a positive impact on the whole organization? I think is very, very important. Um, and I'm fortunate because my wife, she's a leadership development coach, so I get to overhear a lot of these conversations, and I think that helps me a lot in my work as I'm trying to get buy-in from leaders to invest in emerging technologies. And again, back to that human aspect, all these leaders, they're human as well, right? So making sure that, and often, the higher up you get on the ladder, there's maybe a bigger ego that comes with that, and in some cases, maybe rightfully so, because these people have maybe earned, and often they have earned, right, their spot, because they've worked hard and invested a lot of personal time, money, or whatever it may be, into getting where they are. But at the same time, I think for those folks, it's very important to check their egos, and they're often surrounded by people, especially anyone that's trying to sell them a solution. So they're kind of surrounded by yes people, right? And we all know, without getting into specifics, different types of leaders in the world that we're seeing. As they ascend to more and more power, they surround themselves with more and more yes people, and they live in these echo chambers. So if you are a person of power, right, and that could be, someone that runs a company with 30 people, or a department lead that oversees 200 people, whatever it may be, right? A lot of these folks won't have people that push back on their ideas and their says, because, they're scared of their own livelihoods, or these leaders could be the nicest people in the world, but because of the power dynamic that exists, people will censor themselves and check themselves, before pushing too hard. So I think, again, just that you can't overvalue or overstate like the awareness component. So I think for those leaders, just like as I said in the beginning, like, are you just being honest with what you're trying to achieve, with this change, with this investment, with this technology. And then on the other hand, the people that are then trying to deliver on these things, that they, take all of the stuff on the flip side into consideration is very.
Yeah, the final thoughts I'll leave the audience with on our end is one of the pillars that we work with in 3Peak is change readiness. So we're really big advocates of creating adaptability within your organization, and that looks different. So a small organization typically can adapt quicker because there's less processes, less people. If you're running a huge empire, like it takes a lot longer to actually move that whole ship. Like I was talking to an executive in ExxonMobil, and I was in a cynical place, and I was like, look, at this point, Exxon can just buy any small startup and either kill them or integrate them or whatever they want. And what he was saying is that the biggest risk for Exxon is just how slow it would be. So even if in 10 years the right startups do emerge in a renewable space, they might not act fast enough or be able to actually incorporate that into their company fast enough. It's like an oil tanker. It's such a big ship to turn that even if they can buy anyone in the space, it might still not be enough. And so
Yeah.
this is something that we kind of try to encourage people is to create an adaptable organization, which means that often innovation can come from fringe, either from external kind of startup space, or there's some employee somewhere sitting at some desk that, like me, might just be a little lazy and wants to make something that makes their job easier. How do you identify those pockets of innovation and integrate it into the core, the machine of the company? And that to me is one of the pressing issues of the 21st century is that process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wish I had all the answers for that, because that's stuff we're working with and seeing every day. And um, I think, I think you brought up something really interesting there, the external innovation, if you will, that someone external brings in. But there is so much innovation that happens within organizations. And it could be, like you said, some like yourself who had a good idea, that you saw a solution and you made it happen and you put it together, and then try to get people to use it. And I think fostering, as you said, the change readiness, fostering a culture where no ideas are stupid and everyone feels heard and that they can bring things forward, will create an environment and a climate that will be much quicker and better at adapting to change, for sure. So no, I really like that sentiment, for sure. And yeah, can't overstate the importance of just instilling the right culture and mindset into an organization for to handle change well.
Yeah. Lars, thank you so much. I feel like you're doing the good work, which is supporting organizations that could be conservative to actually refresh themselves and innovate. And like you mentioned, with a lot of things like in real estate, ultimately the end users are benefiting because I get to go to airports with cleaner bathrooms. And that sounds pretty freaking
That's
amazing to
right.
me. So I just want to thank you
That's
for your
right.
expertise, for spending time with me and sharing all your knowledge on this space. I think it's something that it's only going to become more and more important for organizations.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mino. Thanks for having me, and thanks for uh, letting me step onto my soapbox on multiple occasions, and just go on and on about these things that I spend a lot of time thinking about and working with, obviously. So, no, really enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to seeing you next time.
Yes. And to our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you again soon. Thank you.